Welcome back to the final portion of this presentation, Study 3, Ethics, Policy, and Street-Level Bureaucracy and Evaluations for Special Education. I'll be focusing in on my research study that followed 3 school psychologists at the local level, going through referrals, data collection, and eligibility decisions for Latino ELL students to special education. I use the lens of state regulations and district policy because they really are a foundation of what we do in practice. More than any other psychology discipline, school psychologists are really driven to participate and implement state regulations and policies. Historically, I will say that there's also consent decrees that you read about that set the tone for this study. In a lot of ways, we heard that there are fears of misidentifying students, not only in the readings, but also in the study that I provided prior to this presentation. So this actually happens. We are still concerned that we're going to use inappropriate assessment procedures or misidentify ELL students for special education. Well, where does this come from? Let's take a look at Diana versus State Board of Education, 1970, and Guadalupe versus Tempe Elementary School District, 1972. What we know about these 2 consent decrees is that there was a pattern of unfair and biased assessment procedures being implemented, and that oftentimes children were being identified with insufficient evidence or use of inappropriate assessment tools, such as English-only administration of assessments for kids that were non-native English speakers. And so that really sets the tone for this study because disproportionality can have a lot of different patterns of development. What I can tell you is that the research suggests educator decision-making is central to the development of disproportionality patterns. Referrals begin with classroom teachers. However, what I'm suggesting is that school psychologists also play a central role in evaluations and eligibility decisions. School psychologists are even referred to as gatekeepers. We don't embrace it, but we are often called that. And yet our assessments are highly complex and individualized tasks that are difficult to monitor. I don't want to devalue our training and the time that we spend in practicums and internships. However, once we get out into the field, we need guidance. We need to continue to grow. Attending conferences is great, but I can tell you that policy really dictates the practices of school psychologists, and that was fundamental to this study and better understanding how we use policy to guide our decisions. What do we do in practice and how does policy guide us? Well, street-level bureaucracy theory emerged from public service sector, and it's hypothesized that policy was so ambiguous and the demands for services were so high that locally public service workers were translating in their own manners ways of understanding policy to cope with the demands of their jobs. So school psychologists are also public service workers, and we have a demand for referrals for evaluations and for making eligibility decisions. Special education also has a demand in itself as to the number of kids that are being served, and we obviously monitor that from a state-by-state basis. And as I mentioned, policy really is guiding us in a lot of ways, more so than any discipline within the field of psychology. So one document that was available to me during this study in Indiana was Article 7, and specifically that I looked at the Navigating the Course document. I looked at the legal jargon. There is another document available through the Indiana Department of Ed, but this was actually a companion made for parents, published in September 2009, and the document is available to you visiting the link. I will say that the link actually reviews information about from the assessment procedures, the pre-referral process, to the eligibility decisions, and what meetings look like. I challenge you to look and use your search tool or your word find tool for looking at anything that might refer to English language learners, immigrant students, limited English proficient students, culturally responsive practices. Look in that document and tell me if you find anything in reference to those different keywords, because this is the document that guides all practices for all educators in the K through 12 setting in regards to special education. When I looked at the three school psychologists that I was following and studying, I found that they all were involved in assessment pretty early in the process, from the intervention process to the referral. And they often reported policy was pretty ambiguous and difficult to understand, and there was a lot of confusion. Training was often limited to the school psychologists I worked with, specifically on assessment procedures. So professional development on assessment was not a priority for the three school psychologists that were involved. Data is important to us as a profession, but we found that data-driven decisions were sometimes challenged because testing strategies were limited, tools were limited, and they were limited to the training that was available to these school psychologists. So it almost challenged the decisions of school psychologists in ways that one would not imagine. Now, to what extent do school psychologists use policy to really make decisions in their evaluations and eligibility meetings? I can say that there were a lot of factors that mediated how often they referred back to policy or ethical or legal jargon, specifically like administrators. Administrators had a primary role in sometimes making referral decisions or eligibility decisions. If the school district had a history of disproportionality, that also was an impact or a factor that might sway a decision in the school district. Years of experience or their knowledge and familiarity with Latino culture and Spanish language sometimes was an advantage or a disadvantage depending on their situation. And so that also mediated how often a school psychologist might refer back to legal documents. I'm going to walk you through the three school psychologists I studied. I can tell you that Article 7 trickles down from the school district down to the special ed department, the schools, and then to the practitioner. I can tell you that in Joyce's case, she had the influence of her principal in her pre-referral meeting. So it really was at the school level where she was impacted. She came into a meeting, they talked about data, and at the end, there was this awkward voting process in which at the very end, they asked the school psychologist to be the final vote. And when she wasn't sure how to answer the question because there was no black and white perspective for her, one teacher looked over and said, well, when do we refer a child that is learning English for an evaluation? How do you know? And when she referred to the research that's available to us about language acquisition in regards to a 5 to 8 year process for learning language, the teacher scoffed and just basically rolled her eyes and said, well, I guess we'll wait until middle school to see what happens. Now, at the time, the child is in elementary school, so as you can imagine, this person is being sarcastic, and the tone is somewhat hostile towards the school psychologist. And so, how does she reflect on this meeting? In some ways, she says, well, it was a lot of people there. There was at least 12 people in the room at the time. And the principal really took a leadership role when it came to the decision about testing. Sometimes he's not that blunt about it. She laughs. So that kind of set up what my role was going to be because he said the answer and then said, what do you think, in a way. So sometimes it's more people looking to me for how do we know whether this is appropriate to do right now? And that really changed that dynamic. So she had both types of questions towards thrown in her direction. And that was a very challenging situation for her. Then we have another school psychologist that really was in a tough situation because she was actually going to refer or recommend that a child be placed under the disability category of cognitive disability in an early childhood setting with a child also acquiring English. She had to sit across in a pre-eligibility meeting with her ELL coordinator, her special education director, and the supervising school psychologist. And she's presenting her data, even though she has the data and the information that's relevant to the decision. The ELL coordinator states to her, I don't feel comfortable labeling this child with a cognitive disability. And so you have to ask yourself, well, why is there so much of a pre-eligibility meeting in this case when in reality she has the data to support the decision? She didn't have a lot of years of experience, and the district also had a context of disproportionality, so we can kind of imagine what was going on in her situation. In her case, she says, in reflection of this meeting and in general to decisions she's been a part of, I feel like the decision that we recommend typically is the one that the committee goes with because it's kind of black and white. It's political. Like, for example, this kid is white. He can be autism spectrum disorder, or he can be emotionally disabled. He meets the autism criteria, but we're kind of getting our numbers back on disproportionality, and they're not looking good. We have too many white kids under autism. Let's just put him in emotionally disabled category instead when he truly has Asperger's. And you're like, but it's autism. And I'm pretty sure the law even says you can't make a child emotionally disabled if they have autism or vice versa or something like that. So as you can see, there's a difficulty in understanding what does the law say or what does the eligibility criteria look like, and that's actually what she's referring to, but she can't quite put her finger on it, but she knows that it's not legal. She just can't reference it. Then we have Madison. She is actually tons of years of experience. She's put into leadership positions in her school. She's bilingual and bicultural. She has a lot of familiarity with the community and with the families. And what we see is that they give her a lot of independence. They kind of give her the benefit of the doubt, and she really embodies this idea of a gatekeeper. In her case, they say, we were involved so early in the process that I didn't feel there was as much confusion. So it wasn't as much of an issue because I was so involved. I have been typically so involved in the decision of yes, we should pursue or no, we shouldn't. So she admits that oftentimes people rely on her as almost as that final decision point. So if I was to summarize this last study, I can tell you that there's a lot of information that came from it that was rich and interesting and has a lot of implications for practice. But if I was to say one of the most challenging aspects is to observe that school psychologists have very limited exposure to policy training or information from the legal perspective, yet they're often the go-tos for being informants and implementers of policies. And yet there's this power differentials with the different school members, such as administrators or school districts, on how to make decisions for eligibility, especially if disproportionality has already been deemed a problem in their school district, which is very problematic. I will tell you that there are things that we could be doing, and I recommend looking for information or inquiring about it once you are in a school context. Look at the documents that are provided. For example, I recommended to Indiana stakeholders or educators that we review memos. Look at the memorandums that come your way or to your school district. This one was addressed to state directors of special education, and then it trickles down to school districts, published in 2011. Here we have one that specifically says that it has come to the attention of OSEP that in some instances, local education agencies may be using response to intervention strategies to delay or deny a timely initial evaluations for children suspected of having a disability. And so what they're saying is you cannot delay or deny an initial evaluation due to response to intervention. So we can't just continuously wait and see. I can tell you that RTI, or the response to intervention and referral process, can be a hindrance to getting services for Latino ELL students from what I observed. A lot of kids wait in the process. For one of the cases, we actually had a student that was in the RTI process for over 2 years. Another child that was waiting for an evaluation and then moved and was not identified. And so there's a lot of implications for children in this process when we're waiting to see what happens with language versus abilities. So what should we consider? Well, I can tell you NASP and APA provide us ethical considerations because definitely these folks that I was working with faced a lot of ethical dilemmas. And ethics may require higher standard of behavior. Always remember that the primary client is the child. And if there is a conflict, bring it to the attention of the administrators or the people that you work with to make sure that they can help you kind of sort through those dilemmas. I also say, try to think about how to identify the problem. Be a part of the process. Talk to your administrators, talk to your special education directors. Be aware of what the disproportionality patterns are. I can tell you that there's guiding documents available out there for you to be able to do this work. So I know that this has been the final portion, a lot of information, but I can thank you for your time and your interest in the topic and wish you well in your practices. This is my current email information, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.